What's the best way to teach grammar? Explicitly laying out the rules for students or giving them opportunities to discover it as they go. The research is clear, but it's probably not what you were taught in your teaching program. Today, we're exploring deductive versus inductive grammar teaching.
Welcome to the DIESOL podcast, where we focus on developing innovation in English as a second or other language. Hello, everybody. I'm Brent Warner, professor of ESL at Irvine Valley College and blogger for Tesol and other things like that. And of course, I'm here with the wonderful Ixchell Reyes, also teacher trainer, and some of that conversation is going to come right into everything today. So Ixchell, today we're looking, we haven't done a like core competencies conversation in a while, and we're like,
right,
we're a Tesol ESOL podcast, and we haven't really had,
but we've done AI, so I mean, and that's like the latest one.
We're always circling it, right? It's always on the, but like we haven't done it like, hey, let's talk about grammar, let's talk about reading. The last one we did was almost a year ago, which was idioms, I think. But today we're talking about how to teach grammar, and you've been working with some of your own students on this recently, kind of going through courses and the processes and everything like that. So let's delve in. Delve in is what we're not supposed to say anymore, because AI says it so much that now humans are accused of becoming AI if they say delve in. So we'll say what I would normally say, which is let's dive in or jump in.
Or jump in.
Yeah. Okay, so Ixchell, let's get started here. A little bit about crashing, right? We can't have a grammar conversation without talking about crashing. So what do we know about Stephen Krashen? What are we taught?
Well, he teaches that, or he's known for teaching that grammar is best acquired implicitly through comprehensible input. That's the I+1. But a lot of research pushes back or flat out rejects Krashen's claims.
Well, let's pause here on that I+1, just in case someone's going, wait a second, remind me of that, right? What is comprehensible input, I+1, right? If you've been in your programs, this definitely has come up, and I still like the I+1, and so that is actually still a valuable technique that informs a lot of my teaching, but the idea here is what he is calling is inquired implicitly through comprehensible input. So comprehensible input, I+1, that basically means a little bit harder than what you're currently capable of doing. Is that how you would explain it? Yeah, the I is the information that you already have, or the input. Yeah, the input, and then the +1 is a little bit harder. So just push a little outside of your comfort zone is the idea here. Okay, but Krashen's idea is that it's best acquired implicitly, and we'll get into this in depth. But essentially, not being taught directly, but you would just learn it through the nature of being exposed to it. Okay, right. So what are these methods? Let's look into it. You take over.
Yeah. So the two methods that we have are the inductive method and the deductive method. And I guess you want me to explain them now?
Briefly, yeah.
You want me to break them down? Okay. So the inductive method is where the language examples are presented first, and learners are encouraged to detect patterns or look at similarities and differences within the patterns and work out rules for themselves. So they're sort of discovering the rule, arriving at a rule on their own. In the deductive method, learners are given explicit rules by the teacher, and then they are giving corresponding examples. So I would, it's just provided for them. They're not discovering it. They're just applying the rule to different examples.
Yeah, so the way I kind of think about this, I'm not sure if this is quite right, but I kind of think of it in the terms of like putting together a puzzle, where with the inductive method, it's just like, go figure it out, and the puzzle will become clear as you build it and as you keep putting the pieces together, right? Whereas the deductive method is kind of like, look at the picture on the box of the cover and then find the puzzle pieces that match up with those to help you align and figure out how it will come together. That's kind of my little brain version of it. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if we're looking at these, then we've got inductive and deductive, and we'll get into them pretty in depth in a minute here. But I think before we get into it, I would say that the pushback on crash-in, part of this comes in from this research, like from Norris and Ortega, that basically says, they've interviewed students, they've interviewed teachers, they kind of got information, and they've seen that students who get some explicit instruction in grammar tend to perform better. Right. So they're taking a look at that information. And then the second part, Shell, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this as well, especially, just your own experiences. When we look at like children learning their first language, I know you're paying a lot of attention to your nephews as they're growing up and learning language. I think a lot of people who like to support crash-in say, hey, well, we watch children and they just pick up stuff and it's magic and amazing. And they say, well, and we don't really explicitly teach, but I think that we do teach children over and over and over how to say things correctly, right? We correct them so that, like, the children says paschetti, and like they're not going to stop saying that unless we say like, no, it's oh, you mean spaghetti, right? Or grammar, when they're using a verb forms incorrectly, we will say, oh, you mean this, right? And we just repeat it to them until they start processing it. So that is not just exposure, that is being taught. A lot of it is figured out, right? But also a lot of it is taught.
And particularly with children, and this is what I tell my teacher trainees, is that children just get so much of this explicit examples because their nurturers, whoever's with them, or the caretaker, will have so much more patience than we have with, like, let's say an adult learner, right? It's like, how many times I have to tell you it's opportunity. The word is opportunity. But with children, we tend to really, even, children may not even pronounce those words correctly or put the syllables in the correct order until much later, but they're constantly hearing it, right?
Yeah
Constantly hearing a correction and getting the correction.
So, and adults don't get, the adult learners, or even young adult or teenage learners don't get that constant repetition of like being told over and over again so much, right? And so it's a little bit of a different setting, and we have to be aware of that. But I
was going to say, even if you think about research that has been on how instructors approach the different genders, females tend to get more feedback, right? And so again, as you get older, what's going to happen to our male learners? So I often think about these things. These things actually do pop in my mind all the time. So or also if you're a male teacher versus a female teacher, and how that plays into the classroom.
Yeah, well, it's also, just to get into a little bit of that side conversation, that's kind of destructive for males too, because I know I'm so guilty of like, oh, I should just be able to figure this stuff out for myself instead of getting a little help. And it's like, well, oh my God, like it's
programmed.
I have that. It's a bummer. Like when I think, when I really think about it on that level. But anyways, let's jump into specifically, let's go into the deductive approach, because I know you've talked quite a bit about that.
So the deductive approach, or the explicit approach, is the one, again, where we said the teacher presents a grammar rule, right? A grammar rule or a grammar paradigm, and the students analyze it to understand how it works. So you'll have examples right after it, and the emphasis is really on accuracy. So the teacher will present a general rule up front, then they have the examples with the rule, and the learners practice using the rule in the exercises. And this is the type of method that our grammar textbooks often have. I don't know if you're like, the Azar, which is not a bad, right? Azar's used everywhere.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's part of the conversation we want to be careful about, right? Is like, it's not to say that like, hey, just because this is partially disproven or not totally accurate, it doesn't mean that what we've done is wrong. It means that we need to think carefully as we're continuing to go through our teaching processes, right? And so because for example, Azar, I have loved a lot of Azar's content.
Absolutely.
And it's so clear. And as an adult learner, we have that conversation about like in andragogy as compared to pedagogy, adults want to know why they're doing something and the process of doing it, whereas children more are likely to say, hey, not really care about why, they're just told to do it, so they do it and they figure those things out, right? So those processes can be a little bit different here, but I want to make sure that we're kind of stepping through it all.
Sure. And then some of the pros, for example, are that this approach provides clear structure and guidance, particularly for students who are, just learning or exploring with the language. It's efficient for introducing new concepts. So if you're tight in time and you have to cover a lot of material, you could still efficiently finish a lesson by simply cutting to the chase, right? Having that paradigm and then having students practice. And also when we think of our students who might come from places where they're taught particularly in this style, it might be suitable for those learners, right? They prefer explicit instruction.
Yeah.
But there are cons.
Well, let me pause. Let me jump into these pros here, because for sure these are really powerful ideas, right? And so I'm thinking about this, and maybe I'll need to combine these a little bit later, but I'm thinking about this in terms of my own learning. Is like, I like just opening up a grammar. I mean, of course, obviously as a language teacher, it's I like opening a grammar book, but to really see and going, oh, okay, that's the nuance that comes along with this, or here's kind of the hidden meaning underneath it, or the thing that's not said. And this happens a lot in Japanese, and it's like, oh, okay, I didn't really know that part, that was being communicated. And so to me, to see that explicit thing and then recognize it and start working with it from there is really powerful. So pros, there are definitely pros sides to the deductive approach,
and I think
right?
I agree with you as well. When I'm learning or trying to, explore another language, I like to see the rule, and because it helps me. It's almost like a shortcut to start to feel like I understand some of it faster. But as I said, there are cons. It may not encourage deep understanding or critical thinking, because you're basically just repeating, right? And then it's very easy to get into that whole drill and kill approach as well, especially also if you're trying to hurry up and have the students accomplish several exercises in the book and then call it a day. The other con, which for me, I tend to notice a lot, is that some learners may memorize the rules without grasping the underlying patterns. And then what happens is they think, oh, I've got this down. But then they generalize that rule into other areas, and then they find out that, wait a minute, why isn't this working here? How come this is not working? And then they get frustrated, and then they start thinking they just start hating English. And I've heard that over and over. But I know everything about modals. I know all the rules. I can tell you all the rules. But then they're not thinking critically about what that relationship of the clauses or what the verbs within a sentence are trying to convey.
Yeah, and I want to get just touch back on the drill and kill part of it. Is sometimes if you see, like, this is part of the problems with worksheets in general, right? But it's like, you'll see like, hey, here's the list of all the grammar and here's what you're expected to do. And so let's say it's a close exercise, right? And it's like, hey, here is the verb that we're talking about, and you're going to put it into past tense, for example, right? And so then it'll be 15 questions on a page or whatever document you're working on, and the students just look at the word and then write the past tense word, right? They don't look at the sentence. They don't look at it
holistically.
Yeah, it's just a zip right through. And so it's like, well, okay, being able to convert the verbs is part of it, but it's not understanding, and it's not spending the time to allow your brain to process it so that it becomes a productive skill for you in the future, right? And that's part of where the problem lies.
Right. And then, of course, it's like, but I've studied so much and I memorized all these rules. And it's like, well, it doesn't really work that way.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of the overview of deductive approach. Let's take a quick break and then we'll come into inductive.
if you haven't checked out our latest YouTube video, we uploaded a panel discussion on teachers' experiences in the age of AI. We sat down with Denise Maduli-Williams, friend of the show, Dayamudra Dennehy, and Eric Roth, friends of the show, to hear the ups and downs of what's actually happening in classes and campuses with a new understanding of education and AI.
And only on YouTube. It's not on the podcast. Give it a check.
That's right.
Okay, so we talked about the deductive approach, Ixchell. Let's shift over and talk a little bit about the inductive approach, or the discovery method. So what do we need to know about this?
So the inductive approach is where language examples are presented first, and then learners are encouraged to detect patterns and work out rules for themselves, and then together they arrive where they, quote unquote, discover that grammar rule. So again, it's observing patterns. The teacher is not giving it to them. The teacher is maybe guiding them toward it if necessary, but it's the students who come up with the rule themselves. The emphasis here is on fluency.
So can we talk about this for a second? Yeah. So when you're saying that a teacher is guiding them but not telling them what it is, are the students aware at this point that they should be looking for something, or are you just reading something with a bunch of present progressive examples in it and not even how much is that guidance needed for them to recognize what they're looking for?
So of course I think that it's necessary for the teacher to set up an discovery method grammar activity by eliciting maybe perhaps language from the students first, and then writing out that language, whatever that target grammar structure is, writing several things down, several examples down, and then asking students to notice. And I use the word notice because that's the keyword I ask my students. I usually say, after they've given me, of course, I'm coming up with the question that's going to arrive at the target language I want them to produce, or to get closer to producing. I might say, take a look at what you just gave me. Do you notice something? What do you notice? And it's a lot of open-ended questions, because now, and I usually tell them, put on your, I know in kindergarten we say, put on your thinking hats, but I tell them, put on your smart glasses on and take a look carefully. And I do it with adults. And then they start really thinking critically. Some might mention patterns that I'm not focusing on. They might say all the sentences have a period. And I would say, yes, you're right. Absolutely. Because I'm counting all the positives. Yes, periods are important. Yeah. What else do you notice? So again, but it reinforces the fact that they're analyzing. They're not just giving you a word in a pattern, right? They're really thinking about, it's like with a detective's eye is what I like to say.
Yeah. So you might be kind of saying, hey, there is a goal. You can kind of choose for yourself with this method, right? About like how clear you want to be with them. And there's a trade-off here, which is time in the classroom, right? And I think we'll talk about that a little bit later. But the less direct you are, the more inductive you are, the more time it actually takes, right? And that's part of the process, but it also allows for that thinking, right? That processing that is going to solidify ideas a little bit more clearly later. Okay, so and
I think again, when you're eliciting the language from the students, then the learners are playing with the language, naturally engaging in communication. And I think that oftentimes when let's say we're doing something in the deductive approach, we're skipping that aspect of it. We're not letting the students have that time to negotiate, because it does take time. It does take patience, and you can't necessarily do it in a class of 30 all the time and for every concept. But again, there are particular grammar points that might lend themselves very well to the discovery approach. And the students are able, again, I'm always of the school of thought that if you're speaking about it, if you're using it, then you're going to internalize it. If you repeat it, if you're hearing it and it's not coming from the teacher, then you're more likely more likely to help another learner, which means you're again repeating something and you're creating your own you're internalizing faster than if you're just repeating, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Also, if the teacher is eliciting the language from the students, then it's very much likely to be a function-based lesson that follows, where students are able to use the language in a real world situation, which is again creating an authentic language experience, right?
Yeah. And I think that part is, I mean, that's kind of the part that makes it a lot of fun for it, mm-hmm. which is like, because when you discover something, right, mm-hmm. when you feel like you have found something out by your own volition, there's
mm-hmm.
a lot of power, and the emotional connection to it makes it a lot stronger.
Chemically in the brain, there's a release of a chemical when you solve a puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. So if you are constantly or throughout your lessons or throughout your teaching, if you're weaving this approach in there, then students begin to learn to be curious mm-hmm. rather than to be fed the answer, because they want to discover it, right? It's kind of like when you don't want spoilers for something, right? And students are finding these things out without, unless you see them really, really struggle and totally lost, and you guide them through, because you also don't want them to be frustrated to the point of giving up.
Well, I like that. I think it's worth repeating, is that students learn to become curious and value mm-hmm. that, right? I mean, that's such a powerful mm-hmm. thing that, a lot of times we might skip over as language teachers and go, oh, that's not content. But it's like, no,
we don't have time.
Really important. yeah,
right.
For sure. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So we also do have some pros and cons. Again, this one does encourage active engagement and critical thinking, and that's the part that takes time. mm-hmm. It develops the learner's ability to discover language patterns independently, which means that if they're going home and they're trying to study or they come upon some new grammar point, they might attempt to uncover it on their own without the teacher mm-hmm. there. And just that in itself, that's so powerful. As a whole, this just promotes deeper understanding.
Well, I'll also say too that, like, when I do inductive lessons, for example, and some grammar point comes out of it, those are the times when I'm more likely to get an email from a student or a message and say, hey, I saw this language on a billboard, or yes. something like that, right? And I find that those are a little less common when we do something explicitly, right? Mm-hmm. Explicitly, they're like, okay, yeah, it exists, right? And I see it's out there. But like when they think, when they feel that they've discovered it and then they see it in the real world in action, they get more excited about it too. So I think that's also a real pro in connection.
Right. And as for the cons, as we said earlier, it does take more time, especially since they are discovering and they're analyzing. It might take the teacher a while to get them to where, they're producing that language. And so you might have to plan out carefully which concepts you're going to teach inductively. It also means that some learners may struggle with this kind of approach because they may be so used to like, no, just tell me the rule. I just want to know. And they're just not used to it. So they just, again, they struggle without clear guidance. And I think it's worth also trying to help those students to recognize that, no, there are other ways of looking at grammar and you can use the one you prefer, but here's another way.
Well, this is the one actually I think is quite important because it gets into the problem with just being exposed to the language is that, so for example, here I'm living in Japan right now. And when I watch Japanese television, if I don't know what they're saying or I don't understand it, I'm not just going to sit there long enough and figure it out. Like I can just imagine my own meanings for it. And I go, maybe it means this. And it's like, yeah, but maybe it has nothing to do with that at all, right? Like maybe that's not what the structure is. Mm-hmm. And so I know, that is not an example of a taught lesson with this, but it is to say that just the exposure alone doesn't quite cut it, right? And so, and it doesn't necessarily mean that we'll get the information correct.
Yeah, you still need the teacher to guide. I've taught many lessons inductively where at the end of eliciting language, my students didn't get to where I wanted them to get. And I might erase a couple of sentences and start with one they gave me and then follow with another one to sort of push them along, because I also don't want them to feel like we lost time or we wasted time or whatever they gave me wasn't connected at all. I still want them to, I call it like my recovery from an inductive teaching, not failure, because it just, again, it depends on what my students come with.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So we've got the two approaches. We've kind of hinted at the answer to this, but the best way to teach grammar is
combining both of them.
Yeah, so I think it's worth saying, it's like we're kind of joking about it, but the truth is there's a lot of teachers out there who haven't really taken that, they've, for example, taken the inductive side so to heart, and not, because they really think, oh, this is the best way to do it. And we totally understand it. And we spend so much time studying crash-in, for example, in the beginning. But the truth is we do need to combine these things, right? We need to be actually conscious and proactive in saying, hey, there are times to teach and there are times to discover, and the real trick in teaching is balancing those.
Absolutely. I think, again, I'll always tell my teacher trainees that initially when they start teaching, they may feel the most comfortable with deductive, just because they can just give the rule and not worry about whether the students are going to get it, quote unquote, or not, and then just give them the examples and then have them circle or underline or fill in the blank. But I also encourage them not to get stuck with that approach, because there is so much value in bringing to me, the inductive method brings it to life. And so you don't want to rob the students of that opportunity if you're able to do that within your lessons.
That's right. Yeah. I think the other kind of, we've talked about it, right, is the time that goes into it. And I think sometimes teachers feel like they're wasting time by, by doing an inductive approach. And so if they're more prone to doing the deductive style, they'll be like, oh, well, it's faster, right? It gets everything through, and they're going to end up with the same information. And it's like, yeah, but it's not processed at the same level, right? It's the difference between, making your own meal and enjoying that process versus just going out and buying some fast food, right? It's like, well, they will both nourish you in one way, but there's value sometimes.
There's so much value in that process.
Yeah,
there's so much value in that process.
All right. So I hope that kind of helps people as they're kind of thinking through. To me, I'm glad we talked about this, Ixchell, because these types of conversations, kind of back to school conversation, back to grad school conversation, right? Revisiting these things and really making sure that we're still executing best practices is tricky, right? Because sometimes we start getting into our own habits, and maybe we say, oh yeah, I learned this, but I forgot, and so I just kind of leaned towards one side or the other instead of really continually reinforcing for ourselves that we need to be proactive in making sure that we're teaching the best way that helps our students.
All right, it is time for our fun finds, and this time around I have the Roxy Minnow slip-on shoes. Do you remember the Roxy brand, Brent?
Oh yeah, sure. That's a big Southern California thing.
Yeah, they don't know Roxy,
right?
Here in Texas, they don't know Roxy. I've told everyone, like, what's Roxy? Roxy! Anyway, surfer brand. But this is my 6th pair of Roxy Minnow slip-on shoes, and they're just so comfy, and they haven't stopped making them. They're affordable, and again, for sometimes I still want to look a little dressy when I'm working, but also be comfortable, and these are just the right kind of shoes. So the Roxy Minnow slip-on shoes.
6 pairs, though. That's not like in a short time. I mean, these are not cheap shoes, right?
I don't have 6 pairs. I've gone through 6 pairs.
Dang.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I love these shoes. Like, it's been 10 years with them.
Awesome.
What do you got?
So Mine is this is for the coffee nerds out there. This is called the 4-6 method. I did not know about the 4-6 method before, and I just learned about it the other day, and I've been testing it out, and it is awesome. So if you want to fine tune your coffee game and really be able to say like, hey, with the same beans, I can choose whether I want this coffee to be a little bit more sweet or a little bit more floral. I can choose whether I want it to be light or a little bit more full-bodied, just in the way that you pour your water. I've been a coffee nerd for a while, and I did not know about this. So I learned this thing. Yeah, it's called the 4-6 method. I'll put a link up, but it's really great if you want to get a little bit more nerdy and get a little bit better taste out of your coffee. All right, so for show notes, you can find the episode and other episodes at diesel.org/106. We are on YouTube and Instagram at DieselPod, and you can go find us out there on the internet. I am at Brent G. Warner.
And I'm at Ixy_Pixie. That's IXY_PIXY.
Ixchell, we still have not come up with a good way to say this, but our mystery language global phrase is...
Eu não posso ser professor sem expor quem eu sou.
Okay, so if you can figure out what that means, send us a message on the socials or send us an email, and I think we're sending people stickers or something if they get these. So so go ahead and send us a message. I'm sure that there's at least one or two of you out there who knows what that means. That's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Diesel podcast, and we will see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.